Hi everyone, and welcome back to another development video. The first in many, many years, I believe. I'm not even sure if my other videos are still available. I'll have to check that. I guess we'll have to go through a recap then. Many, many years ago, I was working on a video game here in Unity, which was a combination of Trade Wars and Starflight, which would allow you to fly around in a universe and basically trade goods. So you'd buy low, sell high. It would have a market that responded to your actions as well as the simulated actions of NPCs. You'd have to fight off pirates. You could investigate anomalies, wormholes, asteroids, find abandoned bases, do all kinds of wonderful stuff. But as you can imagine, just from my description, that was pretty ambitious. And considering that it was my very first real go at attempting to create a game, and the fact that it was in 3D, meant that it was probably doomed from the start. So fast forward to now, which, you know, is, I think the last time I tried that was maybe about 3 years ago. The urge never kind of left. The urge never kind of leaves in situations like this. So what I have here in front of me is another attempt, except this one's a little more stripped down. As you can see, we are now dealing with 2D, top-down, instead of 3D. And whereas in the previous iteration I focused first on data and worrying about save state and things like that, this time I thought, well, you know, let's just get the mechanics down first. So we're looking at our player object, because that's something that I'd never actually gotten around to in depth in the previous iteration. Being 2D instead of 3D kind of actually imparts a lot of advantages, most notably the fact that as a visual developer, I don't have to worry about getting a decent 3D model. And I don't have to worry about, you know, eventually getting a competent 3D model. There's a lot of good 2D art out there available on the asset store that I could buy. And if I was really a glutton for punishment, I could try making my own. So what we have here in front of us, though, is a free asset pack from the asset store that I'm using for testing. So what are we doing here? Basically, we have our player, and it is in orbit around a planet of no consequence. And we are represented by a player character. The player character in this case is an empty game object, and it serves pretty much as our physics body, and also our how we control the ship, and also contains information about the character yourself, with name, portrait, wallet, and so on and so forth. This is not really participating. This is just something I threw in there so I'd remember to throw it in there. But more importantly, we do have physics going on here. So the rigid body on the top level game object allows us to use force, physics force, to drive us forward. It also does the kinds of things that I think people would expect to happen in games like this. We do have mass and linear and angular drag, so once we get moving and we kind of lay off the gas, we will continue to drift for a little bit. But as you'll see right now, we don't really have that kind of in place, probably to the point at which a game like this deserves, but it is just out of the box in place. Gravity scale in this case, of course, is set to 0 because Unity, even in 2D, still treats the top of the screen as up and the bottom of the screen as down. And if we turn on gravity, essentially the spaceship will fall. That's not something we want. So this player character serves as kind of our persistent object. This is what will carry between scenes, but it doesn't have any visuals attached to it. The job of that is handed off to this prefab. And this prefab essentially is a sprite, and the sprite assigned is this spaceship. The reason why this is a prefab is because the original plan was to allow players to buy different parts of the ship and put them together so that you would have a unique visual. some packages that I saw that allowed you to build spaceships from parts were pretty good, but they were many. Even this one that I got for free has a whole lot of many different little parts, as you can see down here, and you're supposed to put all of these together in order to get this. Thankfully, the author of this package already provided us with some, so we just have to drag these sprites and use them. No problem, but I realized that that would end up having a lot of game objects making up just a single character, and if we had to apply that essentially to all other NPCs, basically we would have maybe, I don't know, 24 sprites representing a single actor on the screen, and if you had, you know, even 5 or 6 different actors on the screen, you'd have a whole lot of game objects. I'm not really sure what kind of an impact that would have, but I didn't want to chance it. So we are dealing with a single sprite now. In the actual game, a player would purchase a new ship. They would purchase essentially the chassis, right? And part of that, they would then get individual parts that they could essentially, you know, place in sockets on that hull here. So we do have the hull, which makes up the defensive portion of the ship. You can upgrade this independently of the ship that you own. So you essentially, when you buy the frigate Mark II over here, you'd be getting the scaffolding, and then you would have to plug in your parts to it. So the first thing you'd want to go for would be the hull. The hull has hit points, so when you get hit, this is what you don't want to, you know, allow to get damaged. It also has a mass, because we are using the rigid body physics system. The mass of the sum of the parts of the ship will contribute to the amount of thrust that you'll need in order to move. So that will play into the type of engine that you'll need to buy. So that's kind of a gameplay thing, but it's also kind of a physics thing. The base cost, of course, is how much it's going to cost you to purchase this particular model of hull, and the particular model of hull is represented by the class and size values. The max shield size right here is a stub to remind me to put in shield support, but right now there is no shield support. Obviously, projectiles, lasers, and missiles would have to get through your shields before they can hit your hull HP, so that's kind of what this is going to represent. Speaking of weapons, we do have 3 different types of weapons: projectiles, lasers, and missiles. And each of those was originally going to be represented on the stabilizers, but here we've got them represented on the hull because reasons. When I was working with this game object, it was easier to put the game object that represents the weapon in relation to the sprite that is assigned to this particular object here. So I don't know, it just kind of ended up on the hull. But as you can see, we have one weapon here, and this array of game objects can be, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, depending upon the size of the ship. And each ship that you buy will come with a default basic weapon if you have that option available. Not every ship will have a laser, not every ship will have missiles. Every ship will at least maybe have a projectile weapon or gun of some sort. So in this case we only have one, and it's represented by the projectile weapon object, which we will look at in a few minutes. But that represents the hull, so that's the bulk of your ship. Next comes the stabilizers, and originally, like I said, the stabilizers was meant to be mounting points for your weapons, but I don't know, they kind of migrated over to the hull. That's where they wanted to be. Still, the stabilizer plays into your maneuverability, even though in space you don't have, you know, air friction and so on and so forth. I, you know, kind of envisioned these originally as mounting points, but they kind of mentally showed up as wings, kind of. So I figured, all right, so stabilizers, we'll put our maneuverability stats on here. So when you turn, this value is taken into account. When you buy a new stabilizer, you probably either want to buy something that will let you turn faster or tighter, you know, something like that. And again, we do have mass, base cost, class, and size. The max projectile size and max missile size are legacy properties and will be removed in the future. Finally, we have the engine. And of course, the engine is what moves us. So it does have its own mass, base, cost, class, and size, but it has two unique properties, thrust and power output. So as you've been seeing, each of these three different components represents a different section of your ship that you purchase individually. And each section has its own mass. So the unladen mass of your ship, mass being, a unitless measure in this particular case, represents just the hull, the stabilizers, and the engine. When you put cargo in there, that'll add to the mass. And when you put weapons on there, they'll eventually add to the mass. But right now, the sum of the hull, the engine, and the stabilizers, makes up your mass, and the thrust of the engine has to exceed that mass. Using the physics system, this value needs to be able to push your ship. If it's too low for the mass of the combined parts, then you're not going anywhere. If it's a little underpowered, you're going to be going somewhere but slowly. And if it's overpowered, you're just going to zip off into the far reaches of the universe. So what I had done was I came up with this spreadsheet here, which kind of I've been playing with values. When we're talking about a small ship, a medium, large, extra large ship, these mass values are totally arbitrary. But relationally, we're moving up the scale. So on a small ship, a hull has a mass of 100, stabilizer mass of 25, engines mass of 50, which is what we have represented on in Unity right now, for a total mass of 175. Now, I played around with a couple different thrust values, and we got a decent movement rate at about 875. I have it set to 900, so it's roughly about there. Bumping it up almost by 2 makes us go faster, but not like out of the question faster. It's still a toss-up as to whether which of these columns I really want to use. But once you bump it up significantly, 3 times or more, then you're talking about some pretty good speed, which may be afterburner. And again, I left myself a note that I need to incorporate some some fudge factor here for when we start putting in cargo and everything like that. So a lot of these values have to be kind of calibrated, and I'll have to test them. As you can see over here, my initial values do have some math involved. So this mass right here, 175 times 5, gives me about 875. So that's this value is pretty good, but I don't want to make thrust a multiplier of mass, only because at that point then it doesn't matter what engine you put on there. If you're still doing a multiplication times the current mass, you'll still keep pace with, as the mass moves up. Your thrust will increase even though you've got the exact same engine on there. So these are hand-curated values, and I'll have to play with them a little bit once I get a little further along. But engines also give us power output, and power is used for powering weapons and shields once we get those in place. Right now, it's just a stub to remind myself to use that system, but this will be a consideration when you're buying your engine. You may be able to get something with really good thrust but really crappy power, and once you put that, that plasma cannon on the front of your ship, you're going to realize that you can either power the plasma cannon or the shields, but not both. So it's one of those trade-off kind of deals. Finally, our last script that we have on here is the projectile pooling. And, save on memory when you start firing off bullets. As soon as their lifetime expires, they basically just get shut down, not destroyed, and they get put back into the pool. So we're essentially firing the same bullets over and over again, yada, yada, yada. We have a prefab, and we have a magazine of 20 bullets, but this magazine can grow if we end up firing more than 20. If more than 20 are out there, we'll add 21, 22, and it'll grow. It's just to make sure that we're not, clicking the trigger and nothing's going on, even though we have ammo. So this prefab essentially is what you would buy in the store. You'd say, oh, I want a frigate Mark II, and we would remove whatever you have from the player character object, and we'd replace it with the frigate Mark II, because the frigate Mark II would have all of this data predefined on it. So that way we just have to build it once and set it, test it, make sure it works fine, prefab it, and then put it in the market. And we're done. We can go ahead and we can replace this. If I delete the Frigate Mark II and I put in the Cruiser Mark I, you'll notice now we have this guy here, and he's got his own values. Actually, all of these values, I believe, are still... nope, this guy's actually moving a little bit. Yeah, he's moving a little more because he's bigger, so he's got more mass. Yeah, there you go. So this is structured pretty much exactly the same as the frigate. Below this prefab and all of its scripts, we have an exhaust, which is particle system. Pretty simple right now. I was just fooling around with some of the values and managed to get something that looked like exhaust. I realize I'm going to have to come up with something better because it's kind of annoying. Actually, you know what? I'm going to take this cruiser out because he's not up to date completely. We have exhaust again. But here we have a projectile weapon. Now, I had an epiphany last night when I was falling asleep because the way I had done the projectile weapons on the cruiser made sense. Basically, they were empty game objects that represented locations where bullets would spawn when you pulled the trigger. What that didn't take into account, though, is how you would get the weapon from the shop to your ship. Because I'm more used to working with data, my idea was that we would have a data object in the cloud, and when you're looking at it in the store, you would see the stats. But when you wanted to mount it to your ship, basically we'd copy the data from that data object into the script for the weapon, which would be attached to an empty game object. We don't need to have a representation of the weapon right here. You just have to know that you got lasers, you got missiles, you got cannons. In this particular case, I put the weapon right here on this particular aspect of the sprite, and it is still doesn't have a representation. But this is where the bullet will spawn. But the strength of Unity is when you deal with a game object, you can turn it into a prefab, which basically means this is a template, and you drag out as many as you want, you place them wherever you want, and it brings with it all of the data. So rather than having the data in the cloud and then copying it over as properties, I said, well, why don't we make a projectile weapon, and then we can, create as many of these as we want, give them different names. In this particular case, this is the Series Mass Driver Mark I, and then we just give it different stats. So here this particular weapon, this projectile weapon, the Series Mass Driver Mark I, is of Class A and Size 1, so it's small starter weapon. This is probably what you would get when you buy this particular ship off the floor. Because this is a sprite, we would attach a sprite here that you would see when you're looking at it in the shop. So you'd have like a nice, angled view of the cannon, right? So you'd be like, ooh, that looks really cool. You look at the stats, which are provided by this script, and you'd be like, yes, that's exactly what I want. You put buy, and then you'd come over to your ship schematic, and you'd say, okay, the Series Mass Driver. Click on that. Click on, the place where projectile weapons are allowed to go, and it would be mounted, quote unquote. And essentially what we'd do is we'd remove whatever was in the projectile weapons slot, and we'd replace it with the Series Mass Driver Mark I. So essentially we're doing the same thing with the weapons that we're doing with the entire body in relation to the player character. And the benefit to that, of course, is that it carries the data with us. We don't have to copy data over. All of the data is in the prefab, and we just move it around and attach it where we want it to. And, I mean, that's Unity 101, really, but being a data guy, I've always thought of these things in terms of how do I get data from this point to this point, and it's always been, move it behind the scenes via scripting. This, however, allows me to create this weapon and attach it as a child of the ship. I could take this weapon actually and put it out here in the world, and because it's self-contained, which is another benefit of using a prefab, whenever I fire the weapon, it would also fire. Because what we have here, aside from the sprite renderer, which we don't show when it's mounted, we only use this sprite renderer, activate it when it's in the market. we have our weapon stats. And again, we have the name, the class, and the size. Because it's a projectile weapon, we have a rate of fire, which currently is not working. The power requirement, which is how much power we're going to require, obviously, from the engine. And then our ammo stats, like how much max ammo we can take, how much we have left over. This particular component, what you don't see here, is that this handles your ability to actually fire the weapon. So when you put another weapon on here, it will, again, have its own stat script, and it will also handle its own firing mechanism by itself, which is fantastic, because all you got to do is just make these once. You know, the hard part is copying them and altering the stats, making them worthwhile. But then once you put it on the ship, you don't have to do anything. It's all self-contained, and it all just works. So speaking of works, let's take a look at this thing in action. So when you're just sitting here, you're doing absolutely nothing. You are kind of in the middle of the screen, and when you use the WASD keys, you actually get to move. So right now, I'm seeing a little bit of an issue where our center point is not where it should be, because we're turning in weird directions. But that is because, let me get that fixed, this frigate is not in the right position. And we do need to, we don't have any overrides. Okay. All right, here we go. So now, as you can see, we do turn as expected. Woohoo! And we do have our plume coming out the back. And when we let off, we still kind of, you know, drift a little bit. In this particular case, if we go to player character and we turn down our linear drag to maybe about like 0.25, and then we get ourselves moving, and then we let off, you know, we drift a little more. So, you know, things like the drag values. This would be the kind of behavior that I would expect out of something like a frigate, which is smaller. I would expect something like our cruiser down there to actually be a little heavier, and therefore maybe stop a little sooner. It may not make a lot of sense in space, but I think people might mentally say this ship is bigger, it moves slower, it should, you know, I don't know, some degree slow down. If we did have a station here, you definitely want to be able to stop on it, so you can use the D key to kind of put reverse thrust on it, even though technically you can go in reverse, which I have to stop because that doesn't make any sense. But you should be able to put on the quote-unquote space brakes, and of course you can always just turn around and, you know, slow yourself by thrusting in the opposite direction. So as you saw, when you click on the left mouse button, you will fire, and these bullets over here represent the bullets in our pool, because we actually created copies of the single bullet prefab. They do show up in the world, they're just hidden, except when you pull the trigger by pressing the left button, we make them available, and we again spawn them right here. So let's go find ourselves, and if we split screen this, you'll see that we are firing from where the projectile weapon is, which is right here. Pew pew. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to move off. And we're going to set ourselves right here. And we're going to need to stop ourselves. So yeah, you can fire off, and basically the bullet comes out of there. And we activate these as necessary. So if we just really click really hard, you'll notice we don't even come close to expending all of the bullets that we have available to us. But this saves on memory, so we don't have to create and destroy them every time we need them. And plus, because once we do get NPCs going, everybody's going to start shooting. We're going to have a lot more bullets in various pools. And it may behoove us to have, like, you know, one massive pool where we have a very large number of bullets and lasers and missiles, and everybody kind of draws from that. So we can make sure that we have all of this moving on its own. So basically that's where I am right now. The next step, I think, is to incorporate a lot of the other things that I've done. Some of the other tests that I've done, let me save this off. Some of the other tests that I've done have been the sample scene here with an earlier ship. This no longer works. If we try and fire it up, the ship doesn't actually move, but you'll notice down here we do have a radar. So this does work. Each of these objects here, the planet, the station, and the ship, is represented by, let's see, we can get a sphere, for example, right here, which you can't see in the game, but you can see right here when we're actually looking at it. So these, this is something that is actually very easy to do, but I think probably maybe a lot of people who want to try and do something like this may not know how to do. It's essentially just using two cameras. We have a radar camera and a main camera. Each camera looks at a different layer. In this particular case, our radar camera looks at the culling mask of the minimap. So any of these little dudes right here, the sphere, you'll notice he's on the layer minimap. So the radar camera only looks at minimap, and therefore all it shows is these shapes. And the main camera shows everything but minimap. So that's why we see everything but the minimap. So that's, you know, relatively simple. Right now it's really ugly. What I need to do is I need to be able to get this radar over into my actual usable scene. I got to get a texture. That's what I'm looking for. A texture to actually give it, you know, a radar-y look. And I do also want to put those arrows, you know, around the edge, so you'll be able to see where things lie. So the arrows would point you in the direction of something. The radar would let you know you're coming up on something, and this screen, of course, here would be for your fine navigation, so you could actually get to something. When you come out of a jump gate, you won't know where anything is. You may not even have anything on the radar, but you definitely want to have those arrows to point you in the right direction, color or shape coded to let you know that a starbase is this way, an asteroid belt is this way, and so on. I do have a shooting script here, which takes into account the bullets and the pooling that we had from the other one. But these targets here have actual hit points on them. And the bullets themselves are responsible for doing the damage. They have a damage value. If we look at a bullet, the bullet actually has a time to live of 1 second. So if the bullet continues off in a direction, it will only travel for as long as 1 second before it turns itself off and considers itself to be expended. The actual value, the bullet life script, if we look at that really quick, you'll see over here we actually have a time to live, and we actually do not have the damage. But the bullet does damage, and when it hits the target, when it exceeds the hit points of the target, it blows up. As you can see, fine adjustments are necessary in order to be able to shoot. So it's actually it's already kind of difficult even out of the box to hit static targets. Pew pew. But I need to incorporate essentially all of these elements into the single working system that I have right now, just so I can get them all in one place and start to refine them to make sure that they all kind of work. Because I want to be able to get the player moving, shooting, and understanding where they are in the universe before I start adding other things. After that, then we would work on being able to dock. So we have a collider here on your ship, a collider on this guy, and when they intersect, we detect it, and then we show a user interface that says, hey, you know, do you want to dock? And at that point, then we have to start dealing with user interfaces, because then you become, you know, you get on the station, you have to have options for the station. You can buy new ships, you can buy new ship parts, you can go to the commodity market, you can go to the bar, you can go to the bank, do different things on the station. So that will involve user interface. Ideally, what I would really like to do is once you dock on a station to use Unity's new tile map to create like an isometric space station that you could walk around in. So you'd be able to walk over to the store where you could buy a new ship, walk over to the store where you could buy weapons, walk over to the bar where you could talk to NPCs, you know, get jobs and information, rumors, you could do your banking and so on and so forth. That would be really cool, but, you know, again, now we're talking about pushing our luck. So first things first, getting the player moving, shooting, docking, and we'll go from there. So I will get all of that hopefully in place within the next, I don't know, week or so. And maybe I'll make another video and we'll see exactly where we're at. And then we will reevaluate where we go after that. So anyway, thanks for watching. You know the usual, the like and subscribe.